I remember the exact sound the air conditioner made in that hotel room in Chicago. It was a low, steady, mechanical hum that seemed to vibrate right through the floorboards. I was 54 years old at the time. I was at the absolute peak of my career as a corporate sales executive, closing contracts that moved millions of dollars, managing teams across 3 time zones, and projecting an image of total, unshakable control. Yet I was sitting on the edge of that hotel bed, staring blankly at the carpet, feeling like a complete fraud. The woman I was with, my wife at the time, was already asleep. Or at least she was pretending to be asleep to spare us both the conversation. I had just walked out of the bathroom after spending 20 minutes splashing cold water on my face, looking in the mirror and waiting for a physical response from my body that simply never came. It was not the first time it had happened. The failures had been building slowly over the previous year, but it was the first time I could not immediately blame the scotch, or the late evening flight, or the quarterly pressure from the board. My body had issued a quiet, undeniable refusal. And in that hotel room, listening to the hum of the air conditioning, I realized I had absolutely no idea how to fix it. I felt a cold knot of panic form in my chest, a specific kind of dread that only a man who feels his prime slipping away can truly understand. I know exactly what it feels like to have the engine turn over and over, refusing to catch. You do not talk about it. You just pull up your pants, make a forced joke about being exhausted, and hope she does not press the issue. You hope the darkness of the room hides the absolute panic in your eyes. Because as men, we are taught from a very young age that our physical readiness is the baseline of our identity. When that readiness falters, the silence that follows is deafening. We do not call our friends the next morning to ask if their plumbing is starting to fail. We do not bring it up over a round of golf. We just carry it. We carry the quiet shame into our morning meetings, into our cars on the commute home, into our weekends. We start avoiding the moments that might lead to the bedroom. We stay up late watching television shows we do not even care about. We create physical distance. We become experts at manufacturing exhaustion and stress to serve as an alibi for our failing bodies. That distance does not just stay in the bedroom. It leaks into the foundation of the house. I used to think my previous marriage ended because of the relentless travel, the long hours at the office, the natural drift that happens when two people stop paying attention to the same things. But looking back from where I stand today, I know the physical inconsistency was the invisible wedge that drove us apart. When you cannot trust your own body, you stop projecting confidence in every other area of your life. When you stop projecting confidence, you start playing defense. I was irritable. I was short-tempered with the people I loved. I was constantly waiting for the unspoken accusation that I was not present because I knew I was hiding a massive physical failure. I did not have the tools or the vocabulary to sit down and say that I was terrified of becoming physically irrelevant. So I just worked harder. I chased sales numbers. I treated my body like a rental car that I could just return at the airport and ask for a new one. But you only get one chassis. The first instinct we have when things stop working down there is to look for a quick external fix. We want a switch we can flip. We want a chemical bypass. I remember sitting in a doctor office a few months after that trip to Chicago, looking at a prescription pad on the desk, feeling a mix of profound relief and deep, undeniable defeat. The little blue pills work until they do not work anymore, or until you realize you are now entirely dependent on a synthetic override just to feel like a man in your own bed. It changes the dynamic of your entire life. It requires planning. It removes the spontaneous, unspoken connection that makes intimacy actual intimacy. I did not want to schedule my confidence 30 minutes in advance. I wanted my body back. I wanted the infrastructure to work the way it was designed to work. I also tried the standard advice that gets handed out like cheap candy. If you read anything about male health online, you will inevitably hit the wall of generic information. They tell you to do basic pelvic exercises. They describe it like you are simply trying to stop the flow of water in the bathroom. I spent months doing exactly that while sitting in heavy traffic on the freeway here in Scottsdale. I would squeeze, hold, and release over and over, waiting for the structural integrity to magically return. It did not. It felt like trying to fix a blown gasket by tightening the steering wheel. I was isolating the wrong mechanism entirely. I was treating a complex hydraulic failure as a simple muscular twitch. I was frustrated, and honestly, I was beginning to accept the dark thought that my prime years were simply behind me. I started to believe that this was the inevitable decline, that a man in his late 50s just had to lower his expectations and accept a compromised version of himself. A lot of men are not broken. They are just ignoring the wrong things. We spend our lives ignoring the pelvic floor until it completely fails us. We think of physical intimacy purely in terms of arousal and blood flow, like turning on a faucet in the kitchen. But an erection is a high-pressure hydraulic event. Blood has to enter the system, but more importantly, it has to be trapped and held there. It requires a rigid, engaged infrastructure to hold the pressure. If the foundation is weak, the pressure simply bleeds out. The standard advice I had been following was only scratching the surface. Squeezing one tiny muscle at the front of the pelvis does not rebuild the foundation. The entire pelvic bowl, the deep internal muscles that wrap around the prostate, the bladder, and the base of the anatomy had become weak, loose, and disconnected from the rest of my core. I was essentially driving a high-performance car with a rusted-out undercarriage. I needed to stop looking at quick fixes and start looking at my body as an integrated mechanical system. In sales, when a pipeline dries up, you do not just yell at the end of the pipe, you walk the entire line. You check the pressure at every valve. You find the leak. I needed to walk the line of my own anatomy. Things began to shift a few years ago after I went through my divorce and eventually met Alyssa. Alyssa is 9 years younger than me. She is a former interior design consultant, and she possesses a level of emotional directness that I had never encountered in my corporate life. She does not let things hide in the shadows. When we started getting serious, I knew I could not bring my old habits of avoidance and silence into this new relationship. I could not use stress as a shield anymore. I had to figure out what was actually breaking down inside my pelvis. I started reading. I started looking past the generic magazine articles and digging into how the pelvic mechanics actually support blood flow and rigidity. What I discovered completely changed my understanding of male physical response. I learned that true pelvic engagement is not a simple squeeze at the front of the body. It is a deep internal bracing mechanism. It is about pulling the entire structure upward and inward. Think of it like a suspension bridge. If the heavy steel cables lose their tension, the bridge sags and sway under load. My pelvic floor was sagging. The blood would arrive when I was aroused, but there was no structural tension to hold it in place. The system would just lose pressure and fail. I needed to retension the cables of my own body, but I had no idea how to physically locate those deep internal muscles, let alone train them to hold pressure again. I remember the first morning I actually felt the correct engagement. I was lying flat on my back on the rug in my living room, the early Arizona sun just starting to come through the blinds. I had been reading about a different approach to pelvic health, something far more involved than the generic advice I had failed with before. The goal was to create a total pelvic brace. I placed my hands around my waist, right below my ribs, pressing my fingers firmly into the sides of my abdomen. The instruction was to imagine someone was about to push me hard from the side, forcing me to lock those core muscles solid to protect my spine. I braced. I pushed my lower back flat against the floor, eliminating the small gap under my spine. In that position, my pelvis was slightly tilted upward, facing my rib cage. The upper and lower halves of my core were finally aligned and working against each other, creating a sealed pressure chamber inside my torso. Then came the crucial part, the part nobody talks about when they hand out generic advice. While holding that solid abdominal brace, I took a deep, slow breath in. And as I inhaled, instead of just pinching a surface muscle, I focused my mind entirely on pulling the entire testicular sac upward, retracting it deep into the pelvic cavity. I did not just squeeze. I engaged the entire perineum, the thick muscles around the base, the deep internal hammock of the pelvis, and I actively drew everything up inside. It was a strange, unfamiliar sensation at first. We are not used to consciously moving that part of our anatomy in that specific direction. But as I pulled and held that internal lift for a count of 5, I felt a deep, profound tension that I had not felt in decades. It was not a weak surface twitch, it was the heavy structural engagement of the entire hydraulic base. I held it for 5 seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1. And then I completely let go. I dropped the tension entirely. The release was just as important as the pull. In that moment of letting go, I realized just how much residual tension and numbness I had been carrying down there. I realized how rigid and unresponsive that area had become through years of sitting in office chairs and airplane seats. I took a breath, repositioned my pelvis, flattened my back against the rug, braced my waist again, and repeated the movement. Breathe in, pull the sac upward into the cavity, hold the pressure against the brace, and drop. I did it 20 times that first morning. By the time I stood up, I felt a strange, deep soreness radiating through my pelvis. It was not a sharp pain. It was the heavy, satisfying ache of awakening a muscle group that had been dormant for 20 years. It was the exact same feeling as going to the gym and doing heavy squats after a decade of avoiding the weight room. The internal infrastructure was finally being asked to carry a load again. I kept at it, every single morning lying on the floor before I even had my coffee. After a few days, the soreness faded, replaced by a new, quiet sense of internal control. I realized that my body was not permanently broken. It had just forgotten how to hold the pressure. The communication lines between my brain and my pelvic floor had degraded from lack of use, and I was slowly rewiring them, one repetition at a time. Once I mastered the movement lying down with my knees bent, I made the protocol harder. I kept my legs completely flat on the ground. You would be surprised at how much more difficult that simple change makes it. With my legs flat, it required a massive increase in abdominal control. I had to fight to keep my pelvis tilted properly, engaging my glutes and my lower abs, just to find the physical leverage to pull that internal structure upward. It was genuine, demanding physical work. I was not just fixing a symptom anymore. I was rebuilding the engine block from the inside out. Then I took the practice off the floor. The real test of any change is whether it survives in the wild, in the actual rhythm of your daily life. I started doing the practice while sitting. I would sit on the edge of my heavy leather chair in my home office, keeping my feet planted flat on the wooden floor. I would create that same rigid brace around my waist. If someone had tried to push me out of my chair in that moment, they would have hit a brick wall. And right there, staring at a spreadsheet on my monitor or reading an email from a client, I would take a breath, pull the anatomy upward into the pelvic cavity, hold for 5 heavy seconds, and release. The tension in the seated position was immense. I could feel the deepest muscles of the perineum working against the resistance of my own body weight. I could feel the connection running all the way through my lower abdomen. I would do 15 or 20 repetitions while sitting quietly on long conference calls. Nobody on the screen had any idea what I was doing, but I was actively rebuilding the foundation of my physical confidence while talking about quarterly revenue projections. It felt like I had discovered a hidden lever inside my own body that I had been blind to my entire life. I did not stop there. I pushed the progression further. I integrated it into standing and eventually into walking. Walking is where it gets truly complicated. When we walk, our pelvic floor naturally wants to relax, sway, and absorb the impact of our steps, forcing it to engage, actively pulling that entire structure upward and inward while moving forward required intense mental concentration. I would do it while walking down the driveway to get the mail or pacing the floor during a phone call. I would pull the internal structure up, hold the engagement while taking 5 deliberate steps, and then let it drop. It trained my body to maintain structural support during dynamic movement. It trained the system to be responsive and strong at all times, not just when I was lying perfectly still on a living room rug. I even started combining it with the light resistance work I was already doing in the garage. When I did basic glute bridges on my workout mat, I would not just push my hips blindly into the air. I would brace my core, pull the internal structure deep into the cavity, push my heels hard into the floor, and then drive the bridge upward. The power transfer was completely different. Instead of just working my legs, the entire pelvic region felt solid, connected, and alive. I was integrating the plumbing back into the electrical grid. It did not happen overnight. I am not going to pretend there was a miraculous dawn where suddenly I woke up feeling 25 again. But over the course of several weeks, the changes became completely undeniable. The morning predictability, the simple physical signs of life that I thought were gone forever, started showing up again with quiet regularity. The spontaneous physical response returned. The hydraulic system had its seals replaced. The pressure held. But I will tell you something that surprised me. The physical restoration was only half the equation. The most profound change happened in my head. When you know your body works, the anxiety simply evaporates. The defensive, irritable posture disappears. Confidence returns when the body begins to respond again. I stopped avoiding Alyssa in the evenings. I stopped looking for excuses to stay up late watching the news. The quiet, heavy shame that I had carried through my late 50s simply dissolved into nothing. I realized that I had not been losing my manhood. I had just been ignoring the maintenance of the very specific physical infrastructure that supports it. I had been treating a mechanical failure as a deep personal defeat, and that is the exact trap so many of us fall into as we age. We assume that the decline is a final verdict on our worth as men, when in reality it is just an engineering problem that we have never been taught how to fix. Alyssa noticed the difference, of course, not just in the bedroom, but in the way I carried myself through the house. Confident men move differently. They take up space differently. They do not apologize for their presence or look away when the room gets quiet. We finally had the honest conversations I should have had years earlier in my previous marriage. I told her about the hotel room in Chicago. I told her about the silent panic, the years of avoidance, the absolute terror of feeling my body slip away. And she just looked at me with that calm, direct understanding of hers and said she was glad I finally decided to show up for myself. She did not need me to be perfect or perform like a machine. She just needed me to be present, engaged, and willing to stop hiding from the reality of my own biology. I talk to a lot of men now who are exactly where I was. Men who are quietly, desperately giving up. Men who are looking at their wives across the dinner table, feeling a million miles away, wondering if this compromised, distant version of intimacy is all they have left for the rest of their lives. They send me messages. They tell me they are tired of relying on a pill that makes them feel like a medical patient in their own marriage. They tell me they feel completely disconnected from the lower half of their bodies. And I tell them exactly what I'm telling you right now. You are not a patient. You are a man with a complex physical system that desperately needs recalibration. The blood circulation, the nerve response, the physical rigidity, it all relies heavily on the muscular foundation you build in the dead center of your body. If you ignore the foundation, the house settles, the pipes bend, the valves leak, and the pressure drops. If you have more than 5 decades on this earth, you can no longer afford to coast on the physical capital of your youth. The free ride is over. You have to actively build the internal support structures that keep the engine running. You have to learn how to consciously brace against the decline. I am not going to sit here and tell you that one simple movement erases the reality of aging. I still have to be disciplined. I still have to watch my sleep, manage my stress, drink my water, and keep my blood moving. The maintenance of the machine is ongoing and it never stops. But I am no longer afraid of my own body. I no longer feel like I am sitting in the dark, waiting for the inevitable final collapse of my physical life. I took back the control that I had unknowingly surrendered to time and ignorance. I stopped looking for an external cure in a pill bottle and started doing the heavy internal work that actually changes the structure of the body. If you are sitting there right now, feeling that quiet dread about what your body can no longer do, I need you to hear this clearly. The control is still there. The infrastructure is still inside you. The muscles are still there, buried under years of neglect. They are just waiting for you to demand something of them again. It takes time, it takes focus, and it takes a genuine willingness to face the awkward, uncomfortable reality of your own anatomy. But the return on that daily investment is your life, your confidence, and your connection with the person you love. You do not have to accept the decline. You do not have to fade quietly into the background. That is the truth I discovered on the floor of my living room, and that is how I restored my erection after 60 without pills. Just one small change.